While passing by the cashier at the supermarket, the millionaire suddenly froze, his eyes locked on a necklace. It was the same one his daughter had worn when she vanished all those years ago. Christopher Shelton stood in the doorway of a room he hadn't stepped foot in for years. Dust floated lazily in the air as the sunlight filtered through thick curtains, casting a warm glow on the worn wallpaper. This was Pamela's room, frozen in time since the day she vanished. Her favorite stuffed animal still stood neatly lined up on the bed, and a picture of her smiling, framed in silver, rested on the nightstand. She had been just 7, so innocent, so full of life. Christopher's chest tightened. He had fought to keep everything together, battling the overwhelming grief that weighed heavier with each year that passed. But deep down, he knew part of him had died the day Pamela was taken. He could still hear her laughter echoing through the house, her tiny feet pattering across the floors. Now, all that remained was an unbearable silence that filled every room, every hall. Melissa would have known how to handle this. His first wife had always been the strong one, the one who held their world together. But she was gone too, lost in childbirth when Pamela came into their lives. The bitter irony was too much. Melissa had given her life to bring Pamela into the world, only for the world to steal Pamela away. He moved deeper into the room, brushing his fingers over the dusty dresser. Pamela's school books were still stacked in order, as if she might walk back in any moment to finish her homework. It was a foolish hope, but it was one he couldn't abandon. For years, Christopher clung to the belief that Pamela was somewhere out there, alive, waiting to be found. He had spared no expense, hiring private investigators, making public appeals, working closely with law enforcement. But the trail had gone cold. All he had left was a dim flicker of hope and a heart full of sorrow. After Melissa's death, Christopher threw himself into his work, building his empire, closing deals, and amassing his wealth. He used it as a way to dull the ache and keep his mind off the enormous void in his life. Then, Carolyn came into the picture. She was stunning, kind-hearted, and full of charm. For a while, she made him feel alive again. When they got married, he thought it was a fresh start, a chance to build a new family. But the joy didn't last long. Even with Carolyn by his side, there was always a dark cloud hovering over them. The unresolved question of where Pamela was and why no one could find her. At first, Carolyn tried to comfort him, but over time, the weight of searching for Pamela took its toll on their relationship. Carolyn began to grow distant, and Christopher could feel the space between them widening with every failed attempt and each dead-end lead. He turned his back on the room and walked out slowly, as though closing the door on the past. He couldn't keep living this way. He had to find a way to move forward. But every time he considered letting go of the search, something kept drawing him back. Today was Carolyn's birthday, and he had promised to take her shopping. It was a small escape from the constant sorrow that seemed to follow them. They were heading to New York, and while Christopher didn't care much for the trip, he knew Carolyn loved the city's bright lights and buzz. He told Rebecca to surprise her with something special, maybe some jewelry. It was the least he could do for the woman who had stood by him through it all, even though things between them weren't as close as they once were. He gave one last glance at Pamela's room before gently closing the door. Her memory would always be with him, the pain of her absence woven into every part of him. But life had a way of moving forward, whether you were ready for it or not. He made his way downstairs, where Carolyn stood by the door, waiting. She looked as beautiful as ever, her eyes lighting up when she saw him. "Ready to go?" she asked with a smile, though Christopher caught a hint of impatience in her tone. He nodded, forcing a smile back. "Yeah, let's head out." They drove in silence for most of the ride. Carolyn made some small talk about a dinner party they were supposed to attend later in the week, but Christopher's mind was elsewhere. He was still in that room, standing over Pamela's bed, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. When they finally reached the city, Carolyn's excitement was obvious. She loved New York, the busy streets, the fancy shops, and the endless sense of possibility. Christopher had always found these outings a bit much, but today wasn't about him. His mission was clear: find the perfect gift for Carolyn. As they wandered down Fifth Avenue, Carolyn darted in and out of stores, trying on designer dresses and shoes with excitement. Christopher trailed behind her, his thoughts drifting back to Pamela. He absent-mindedly scrabeckered the busy streets, almost hoping to spot her, even though he knew it wasn't possible. After what seemed like an eternity, they stopped in front of a jewelry store. "I think I'll check this one out," Carolyn said, her eyes shining as she gazed at the sparkling jewels in the display window. Christopher gave a nod and followed her inside. The shop was luxurious, with sleek counters and plush carpeting, the kind of place where a single piece of jewelry could easily cost more than a car. Christopher wasn't one for fancy things, but Carolyn loved this kind of extravagance, and that's what counted. As he stepped inside, something caught his attention, something he hadn't expected. A young woman, a sales associate, was helping another customer. Around her neck was a small, delicate pendant. Christopher's pulse quickened. It was the same pendant he had given to Pamela all those years ago. His world seemed to slow, his eyes fixated on the pendant resting on the woman's neck. It couldn't be. How could it be? The pendant, with its slender chain and the tiny emerald in the center, was a perfect match to the one he had given Pamela just before she disappeared. He could still see her smile vividly, the way her face lit up as he placed the pendant around her neck. Her fingers had brushed against the cool metal, and she had beamed at him. "Christopher?" Carolyn's voice snapped him back to reality. She was standing next to him, holding up a pair of diamond earrings. "What do you think of these?" He barely registered her question. Yeah, they're nice," he mumbled, his eyes still locked on the saleswoman. His heart raced as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Could it just be a coincidence? There must be countless pendants like that. But the way it shimmered in the soft light stirred a flood of emotions within him. "I'll be back in a second," Christopher muttered, already making his way to the counter. He barely heard Carolyn calling after him, her voice fading as he moved toward the young woman. As she wrapped up with another customer, Christopher stood there, his mouth dry, his hands sweating. Now that he was closer, he could see her face more clearly. There was something strangely familiar about her, but he couldn't quite figure out why. Was it her eyes, her jawline? His mind swirled with a confusing mix of excitement and anxiety. When she finally turned to him, she flashed a polite, professional smile. "Can I help you, sir?" Her tone was calm and courteous, but there was a hint of warmth that caught him off guard. Christopher paused, unsure how to begin. His eyes shifted to the pendant she wore. "That necklace," he said, his voice trembling a little. "Where did you get it?" The young woman glanced down at it, almost as if noticing it for the first time. Her hand instinctively touched the emerald pendant. "Oh, this. It was a gift from my mum." Christopher's heart skipped a beat. "Your mother?" he asked, working hard to keep his voice steady. She nodded, smiling softly. "Yeah, it's one of the few things I have from her. She gave it to me when I was a kid." "Why do you ask?" Christopher's pulse roared in his ears. He opened his mouth, but no words came out at first. How could he possibly explain? How could he ask the questions racing through his mind without sounding completely unhinged? He took a deep breath to calm himself. "I used to know someone who had a necklace just like that," he finally managed, carefully choosing his words. "It's pretty rare." The young woman gave a gentle smile, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, maybe confusion. "Yeah, I've never seen another one like it. My mom always said it was special. It's the only piece of jewelry I wear." Christopher's chest tightened. He had to know more, but he couldn't just blurt out his suspicions. Could this woman, standing in front of him after all these years, be his daughter? He needed answers, but he had to tread lightly. "What's your name?" he asked, trying to sound casual, though his heart was racing. "Laura," she said. "Laura Woodward." Laura, not Pamela. Christopher swallowed hard, the rush of hope dimming with her name. But people change their names, don't they? The thought wouldn't leave him, growing stronger with each passing second. Laura Woodward. He said the name softly to himself. It was beautiful, but he couldn't shake the feeling there was more to it. A forced smile crept across his face, his mind racing. Who was this woman, and why did she have Pamela's necklace? He had to find out. Before he could ask more, Carolyn appeared beside him, her eyes darting between him and Laura, clearly curious. "Christopher, what are you up to?" she asked, her voice carrying a slight hint of suspicion. "Did something catch your eye?" Christopher blinked, caught off guard for a moment. No, not exactly," he muttered, struggling to focus. "I was just asking this young lady about her necklace." Carolyn chuckled lightly, clearly puzzled by his sudden fascination. "You're really getting into this, aren't you?" She turned to Laura with a polite smile. "He's not usually big on jewelry." Laura smiled back, but Christopher could sense her discomfort rising. The moment was slipping away, and he still hadn't gotten the answers he needed. "Do you work here every day?" Christopher asked, his voice sounding a bit tense, like he was holding on to something fragile. "You know, in case I want to come back for the necklace?" Laura's brow furrowed slightly. Yeah. "Most days," she said slowly, her eyes moving between him and Carolyn. There was something cautious in her look, like she could feel the weight behind his question, even if she didn't know why. Christopher nodded, forcing himself to pull back. He couldn't press too hard, not now, but he needed to know more. "We'll be back," he said, mostly to himself. He barely noticed Carolyn's amused grin as they left the store, his mind still spinning from the interaction. The pendant. Laura. This couldn't just be a coincidence. As they walked down the street, Carolyn kept talking about the earrings she had her eye on, but Christopher was somewhere else. His mind was racing with thoughts, each one more outlandish than the last. Could it be her? Could this young woman be the daughter he had lost all those years ago? The idea consumed him, pulling him into a storm of emotions. Hope, fear, disbelief. He had to know more about Laura Woodward. He had to know if she was really Pamela. And he wasn't going to stop until he found out. Christopher's thoughts raced as they drove back from the city. Carolyn was chatting away, her voice drifting in the background, but Christopher barely registered a word she was saying. His mind was completely wrapped up in the image of Laura at the jewelry store, the way her fingers naturally reached for the pendant, the exact pendant he had once given to Pamela. Could it truly be her? Could his daughter, who had disappeared almost 20 years ago, have been standing just feet away from him? By the time they pulled into the driveway, Christopher had made a decision. He couldn't let this go. The answers felt too close, just within reach. He had to figure out who Laura really was and why she had Pamela's necklace. Later that night, after Carolyn had gone to bed, Christopher found himself sitting in his office, his gaze fixed on the family pictures scattered across his desk. One was of him and Melissa, smiling on their wedding day, arms wrapped around each other. Another was of Pamela, in one of her last school pictures, grinning with 2 teeth missing. His eyes lingered on Pamela's face, that same pure, hopeful expression she always wore. He had spent years searching for her. In the beginning, the police had been optimistic. They believed someone nearby had taken her, perhaps a neighbor or a family acquaintance. But as days turned to weeks and weeks to months, the trail went cold. After a year, the authorities had all but called it quits. But Christopher never did. He had hired private investigators, spent a fortune on the search, but nothing ever came of it. Pamela was gone, and with her, a piece of Christopher's soul. Now, though, there was a glimmer of hope, and with that hope came the drive to take action. Christopher picked up the phone and dialed an old connection, Eric Gomez, a private investigator he had worked with before. Eric was known for being discreet, methodical, and unyielding. If anyone could uncover the truth about Laura Woodward, it was him. The phone rang twice before Eric answered, his voice low and gravelly. "Christopher Shelton, it's been a while." "Too long," Christopher responded, doing his best to steady his voice. "I need your help again, Eric. It's about Pamela." There was a pause on the other end. "I thought we ran out of leads." "I found something," Christopher said quickly, the words tumbling out. "Someone. A young woman. She's wearing the same pendant I gave Pamela before she vanished. I think she might be my daughter." Eric was quiet for a moment, then his tone softened. "I'm going to need more than just a necklace, Christopher. People move on, and jewelry just gets passed around. You know that as well as I do." "I know," Christopher responded quickly. "But that's not the whole picture. She looks familiar, Eric. There's something about her I just can't shake. I need you to dig into her background and figure out who she really is and where she came from." Eric let out a sigh. "All right, send me the details. I'll see what I can uncover." Christopher ended the call and leaned back, his heart still racing. He had done all he could for now. It was Eric's turn to find the truth. The days that followed blurred together as Christopher tried to focus on running his business, but his mind kept wandering back to Laura. Every time the phone rang, his pulse quickened, hoping it was Eric with an update. Carolyn, of course, noticed his preoccupation. She wasn't clueless, but Christopher kept things vague. He wasn't ready to tell her about Laura. Not yet. A week later, the call finally came. "I've found something," Eric said, his voice serious. Christopher's stomach dropped. "What did you find?" "Laura Woodward," Eric began, "isn't who she thinks she is. Based on the records I pulled, she was discovered abandoned as a child, around 7 years old, just outside a small town upstate. No one knew where she came from, and no missing child reports fit her description at the time. The couple who found her, adopted her, gave her a new identity, and raised her like their own." Christopher felt his breath catch in his chest. 7 years old? "That's right," Eric confirmed. "She had no memory of anything before they found her. And there's more. I found an old photo of her from when she was first discovered." Eric's tone grew more intense. "Christopher, it's her. It's Pamela." Christopher's world seemed to spin. He gripped the edge of his desk, trying to steady himself. "Are you certain?" "Absolutely," Eric replied. "The pendant, her age, the timing, it all checks out. I'm sending you the picture now." Christopher's phone buzzed. He opened the message, and his heart stopped. Staring back at him was Pamela. Her hair was shorter, her frame smaller and more fragile, but it was undeniably her. There was no room for doubt in his mind. Tears gathered in his eyes as he leaned back, overwhelmed by the realization. After all those years, all the searching, Pamela had been alive the whole time, hidden in plain sight, growing up with a different family with no memory of the life she had left behind. But as the initial wave of emotion subsided, new questions flooded his thoughts. How could this have happened? How did Pamela end up abandoned on the side of the road, her past wiped clean? And, most haunting of all, why hadn't he been able to find her sooner? Christopher wiped his eyes and leaned forward, his mind racing with unanswered questions. One question in particular gnawed at him. What about Carolyn? Could she have known? Could she have played a part in this somehow? It seemed unthinkable. Carolyn had been his rock after Pamela disappeared, always supportive, always encouraging him not to give up. Yet now, with this new revelation, he couldn't shake the suspicion that there was more to the story than he understood. He needed answers. Christopher glanced at the photo of Pamela that Eric had sent him, his hands trembling as he tried to process the truth, staring back at him. 18 long years of searching, holding on to hope. And now, finally, it was here. Pamela was alive. But how had she ended up in that quiet town, forgotten, with no memory of her former life? And why had it taken so long for someone to find her? His thoughts circled back to Carolyn. She had been by his side through it all, comforting him through the worst of the grief. But there had always been something off. A tiny voice in the back of his mind whispering that things didn't add up. Now, with this revelation, that voice was louder than ever. Christopher stood abruptly, pacing the room as he tried to piece everything together. He had trusted Carolyn with his life, his heart. Could she really have had a hand in something so dark, so unthinkable as Pamela's disappearance? The thought made him sick, but he couldn't ignore it anymore. He had to face it. Taking a deep breath, Christopher resolved to confront her. That night, as they sat down for dinner, Christopher could barely hold it together. Carolyn carried on about her day, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside him. He waited for the right moment, his heart pounding with the gravity of what he was about to do. After what seemed like forever, he finally set his fork down and looked straight at her. "Carolyn, we need to talk." Carolyn glanced up, her cheerful expression turning into one of curiosity. "Sure, what's going on?" Christopher took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "It's about Pamela." The color drained from Carolyn's face, but she quickly composed herself with a calm smile. "Christopher, we've been over this. We did everything we could. It's time to move on." "I found her," Christopher said, his voice steady. "She's alive, Carolyn. I saw her." Carolyn froze, her eyes widening in disbelief. The only sound in the room was the soft ticking of the clock. She let out a shaky laugh, clearly struggling to keep her composure. "Christopher, that's not possible. You've been searching for so long. How could you?" "I saw her," Christopher repeated, his voice rising slightly. "I spoke to her. She's working in a jewelry store in New York. She goes by Laura now, but it's her. Carolyn, it's Pamela." Carolyn's face turned pale as she slowly set down her glass of wine, her hand trembling. "You're wrong," she whispered. "It can't be her." "It is," Christopher insisted, standing up from the table. "And you knew, didn't you? You knew the whole time." Carolyn's eyes darted around the room, as if she were searching for a way out. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "You made her disappear," Christopher said coldly, his voice unwavering. "You sent her away. You didn't want her here. You wanted me and my money for yourself." Carolyn's facade finally shattered. She looked up at him with tear-filled eyes. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she whispered. "I never wanted it to go this far." Christopher felt the weight of the truth crash down on him. It was out in the open, but instead of bringing relief, it left him feeling crushed. He had given his heart to this woman, trusted her deeply, and she had betrayed him in a way he could never have imagined. His voice shook with emotion as he asked, "Why? How could you do this to me, to her?" Carolyn's lips trembled as tears streamed down her face. "I was jealous," she confessed, her voice breaking. "I thought if she wasn't around, you'd focus on me, on us. I was scared you'd never love me, like you loved Melissa and Pamela. I wanted you to myself, Christopher. I thought we could finally have a life together, without your past constantly overshadowing us." Christopher stared at her, stunned. "You wrecked my life," he said, his voice trembling. "You took my daughter from me. Do you even grasp what you've done?" Carolyn broke down, covering her face with her hands. "I'm sorry," she cried. "I'm so sorry. I thought this would make things better, that you'd be happier without her. I never imagined it would hurt you this much." Christopher clenched his fists, barely keeping his fury in check. "You had no right," he said, his voice icy and firm. "No right to make that choice for me. You stole my daughter's life from me. You took away my chance to be her father. How could you?" Carolyn looked up at him, desperation in her tear-streaked eyes. "Christopher, please," she pleaded. "I made a terrible mistake, but we can fix this. We can still be a family." "No," Christopher cut her off sharply. "There's no fixing this. You've destroyed everything. I'll never forgive you for this." Carolyn's face crumpled, and she collapsed into the chair, defeated. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, but Christopher had already stopped listening. He turned and walked out of the dining room, his heart racing. He couldn't stay in the same room with her for even another moment. The woman he had trusted with everything had shattered his world. Outside, the cool night air hit his face as he leaned against the house, his mind swirling with anger, grief, and disbelief. He had finally found Pamela, but at a cost so devastating he wasn't sure he could bear it. Carolyn had taken everything from him, but now, at least, he had Pamela, and no one would ever take her from him again. Christopher spent the rest of the night consumed by his rage and disbelief, replaying his conversation with Carolyn over and over, trying to make sense of something so senseless. His heart felt like it was breaking all over again. First, he had lost his daughter, and now the woman he thought he could trust had betrayed him. He paced back and forth all night long, unable to fall asleep due to the intensity of his emotions. By the time dawn broke, only one thought stood out clearly in his mind. He needed to see Pamela. He had to talk to her, to explain everything, and finally reveal the truth. But how could he even begin? How could he drop the bombshell that her entire life, everything she thought she knew about herself, was built on lies? He wasn't sure how she would handle it, but waiting any longer wasn't an option. He had to go. Without wasting a moment, Christopher jumped into the shower and quickly got dressed, his mind racing with all the things he needed to say. As he made his way to the door, Carolyn appeared at the top of the stairs, her face streaked with tears, looking pale and fragile. "Christopher," she called out softly, her voice shaking. "Please, let's talk. I was wrong. I'll fix it, I swear. Please don't do this." He couldn't bring himself to look at her. Just the sight of her made his stomach churn. "There's nothing left to say, Carolyn," he replied, coldly, his voice flat and emotionless. "You've done enough damage." Without waiting for her response, Christopher stepped outside and headed straight for his car. He couldn't stand to be in that house any longer. The drive to the jewelry store was a blur, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. What if Pamela didn't believe him? What if she thought he was out of his mind? Or worse, what if she wanted nothing to do with him after hearing the truth? The fear stabbed at him, but he forced it down. He had to do this. He owed her the truth. Once he arrived at the store, he sat in the car for a moment, gathering his thoughts. This was the moment he had been dreading and hoping for years. After taking a deep breath, he stepped out of the car and headed inside. The store was quiet, and there she was, Pamela, or rather Laura, standing behind the counter, arranging jewelry. The sight of her hit him hard. She looked so much like Melissa, with those same soft features and that same determined look on her face. For a second, Christopher couldn't move. His throat tightened, and he struggled to find his voice. Finally, he managed to speak. "Laura." She looked up, surprised to see him again so soon. "Oh, hi," she greeted him with a polite smile. "Did you need something else?" Christopher swallowed hard, feeling his heart race. This was it. There was no turning back now. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's about who you really are." Laura blinked, clearly puzzled. "Who I am?" "Yes," Christopher replied, moving closer to the counter. He saw the confusion in her eyes, and the thought of what he had to say pained him deeply. "Laura, or should I say, Pamela, I believe you're my daughter." Laura's polite smile faded, turning into a frown. She stared at him, waiting for him to laugh and say it was a joke. But as the silence stretched on, her expression grew more guarded. "Excuse me?" Christopher's throat tightened. He knew it sounded unbelievable, but he had to make her see the truth. "I believe you're Pamela Shelton, my daughter. You went missing when you were 7 years old, and I've been searching for you ever since." Laura's face turned pale. She took a step back, her hands gripping the counter behind her. "You must be mistaken," she said quickly, shaking her head. "I'm not Pamela. My name is Laura Woodward. I don't know what you're talking about." Christopher's heart sank, but he wasn't ready to give up. "I know it's a lot to take in, but I have proof. The necklace, the pendant you're wearing. It's the same one I gave my daughter before she disappeared. I've spent years searching for her. For you." Laura's eyes widened, her hand automatically moving to the pendant around her neck. "This was a gift from my mother," she said, her voice trembling. "My adoptive mother." Christopher stepped closer, his eyes pleading. "I know. Your adoptive parents found you when you were 7, just outside a small town. You didn't remember where you came from. You didn't remember anything about your past. They gave you a new name, but you're Pamela. I'm your father." Laura stared at him, her breathing quick and shallow. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "That's impossible. You don't even know me." "I do," Christopher said, his voice cracking. "I've been searching for you for 18 years. I never stopped. I hired investigators and spent everything I had to find you, and now I have. I know it's hard to believe, but I swear to you, Laura, Pamela, you're my daughter." Tears welled up in Laura's eyes as she took another step back, as though she needed more space between them. "I don't understand," she whispered. "I don't remember. I don't remember anything." The pain in Christopher's chest deepened as he watched her struggle, but he couldn't back down now. "It's not your fault," he said softly. "You were taken from me when you were too young to recall, but I'm telling you the truth. You're Pamela Shelton." Laura's hands shook as she clutched the pendant, her mind whirling with confusion. If this is true," she murmured, barely managing to get the words out, "then why didn't you find me sooner? Why has it taken so long?" Christopher's throat tightened. How could he explain the years of endless searching, the dead ends that had worn him down? "I tried," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I did everything I could. But someone made sure you were hidden. They made it impossible for me to find you." Laura's tear-filled eyes locked onto his, her face a mix of fear and disbelief. "Who?" she whispered. Christopher paused, the truth weighing heavily on him. "Carolyn," he said quietly. "Your stepmother. She's the one who sent you away." Laura froze, her face twisted in shock. "What? No, she wouldn't. My mother wouldn't do that." Christopher's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "She did it out of jealousy. She didn't want you in our lives. She wanted me all to herself. So, she made you disappear. Laura shook her head in denial, tears spilling down her face. No, that can't be true. My mother, she wouldn't. I know it's hard to accept, Christopher said gently, stepping closer. But it's the truth. And I'm so sorry, Pamela. I'm so sorry for everything. Laura stepped back, her whole body trembling as she held onto the pendant like a lifeline. Her mind raced, her reality crumbling. I need to go, she stammered, her voice shaking. Pamela, wait, Christopher pleaded, reaching out, but she turned and rushed out of the store, leaving him standing there, broken. Laura hurried down the crowded street, her mind racing, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea where she was headed. She just knew she needed to escape. Christopher's words echoed over and over in her head. You're my daughter, Pamela Shelton. It made no sense. Her whole life she had been Laura Woodward, the adopted daughter of loving parents who had rescued her from a forgotten past. Now this man, this stranger, was telling her that everything she had ever known was a lie. She could still sense the pendant resting against her chest, the one she'd worn for as long as she could recall. Her adoptive mom had given it to her, saying it was a cherished keepsake from her childhood. Laura had never doubted that. Why would she? She had always believed her past was a puzzle she'd never pieced together, but now she wasn't so sure. After what felt like hours of wandering aimlessly, Laura found herself seated on a bench in a quiet park. Her thoughts were a jumble, swirling with questions she couldn't answer. She touched the pendant again, running her fingers over the smooth surface, almost as if it held the secrets of her past. Could what Christopher told her really be true? Could she be Pamela Shelton, the daughter of a man she had no memory of? Her mind drifted back to her adoptive parents, the ones who had raised her since she was little. They had always been gentle and loving, never pushing her to recall anything from before they found her. In fact, they were careful not to bring up her past too much. All they ever told her was the little they knew, that she had been found wandering near a small town, alone, disoriented, with no recollection of who she was or where she'd come from. For years, Laura had accepted that story. She had come to terms with the fact that her early childhood was locked away, buried in a part of her mind she couldn't access. But now, that sense of peace was crumbling. If what Christopher said was the truth, then her life, her very identity, had been stolen from her, and the one behind it all was the woman who had been her stepmother, a woman Laura didn't even remember. The thought made her stomach turn. How could anyone be so heartless? How could someone take a child from their family, from the father who had been searching for her all this time? Laura didn't want to believe it. But the more she thought about it, the more it all started to fit. There had always been a part of her that felt out of place, like something was missing, a piece of herself, just out of reach. She ex-Arnold shakily and pulled out her phone. She needed answers, and there was only one person who could provide them. Laura stood at the doorstep of her parents' home, her heart racing. It had been weeks since she last visited, ever since she moved out on her own. But now, as she stood in front of that familiar door, the place that had always felt like home, doubt crept in. What if they hadn't told her everything? What if her past held more than they had ever revealed? The door opened, and there was her mother, Rebecca Woodward, beaming with her usual warmth. "Laura!" she exclaimed, pulling her into a tight embrace. "It's great to see you, sweetheart. We've really missed you." Laura hugged her mum back, but her thoughts were miles away. She gently pulled back, trying to gather the nerve to bring up the questions she'd been wrestling with all day. "Mum, can we talk?" Rebecca's smile faded just a bit, concern flickering across her face. Of course, sweetie. Is everything okay? Laura nodded, but she knew deep down it wasn't. Yeah, I need to ask you something. It's about where I was before you and Dad adopted me. Rebecca's face went pale, and Laura could sense her hesitation. Why are you asking about that now? Rebecca asked softly, as she guided Laura into the living room. I thought we had put all of that behind us years ago. I know, Mom, Laura quickly responded as she sat on the couch. But something happened today. Someone told me something. And now, I don't know what to believe. Rebecca sat beside her, nervously fidgeting with her hands. What did they say? Laura took a deep breath, her fingers automatically reaching for her pendant. A man came to the store today. His name is Christopher Shelton. He says I'm his daughter, that my real name is Pamela Shelton, and that I was taken from him when I was 7. Rebecca's eyes widened in shock, and for a moment she didn't say a word. Laura watched her closely, waiting for her to deny it and tell her it was all a mistake. But Rebecca stayed silent, her face drained of color, her hands trembling slightly. Mom? Laura's voice was barely audible. Is it true? Tears welled up in Rebecca's eyes, and she looked away, unable to meet Laura's gaze. Oh, Laura, she whispered. I never thought you'd find out. Laura's heart sank. So it is true, she said quietly. Rebecca nodded slowly, her voice shaking as she spoke. We didn't know who you were when we found you. You were just a little girl, alone on the side of the road. You didn't remember anything. Your name, where you came from, nothing. We took you in and loved you like our own. But we always knew. We always knew there was a chance your real family might come for you. Laura's chest tightened as her mother's words hit her. Why didn't you tell me? She asked, her voice quivering with emotion. Why didn't you ever tell me the truth? Pamela wiped her tears, guilt written all over her face. We didn't want to frighten you. You were just a child, and we thought it would be better if you didn't remember. We had no idea who your parents were, or if they'd ever come back. All we wanted was for you to feel safe. Laura stood up, her emotions bubbling to the surface. But I had a family, she cried, her voice cracking. I had a father who has been searching for me all these years, and you never told me. Rebecca stood too, reaching out toward her. Laura, please. I'm not Laura, she shouted, her face wet with tears. I'm Pamela. My name is Pamela Shelton, and you've been lying to me my entire life. Rebecca's face crumbled as she sank back onto the couch, sobbing. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice shaky. I'm so sorry. We never wanted to hurt you. All we ever wanted was to give you a home. Pamela wiped her eyes, her heart torn between anger, confusion, and sadness. She had always loved her adoptive parents. They had given her a good life, a stable life. But now, everything she thought she knew about herself and her past was crumbling around her. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the house, her mind racing as the weight of the truth pressed down on her. Her life had been built on a lie. Meanwhile, Christopher sat in his office, staring at the photograph of Pamela that Eric had sent him a few days earlier. His heart ached as he thought about the emotional storm that had been unleashed. Pamela, his daughter, was alive. But now, in his eagerness to find her, he had torn apart the life she had known. Something else gnawed at him. Betrayal. Carolyn's betrayal. It ate away at him, a wound that refused to heal. She had been behind Pamela's disappearance, and now that the truth was out, he couldn't put off confronting her any longer. This time, he wasn't going to let her avoid the truth or act innocent. He needed her, to admit everything. Taking a deep breath, Christopher rose from his chair and walked down the hallway, his footsteps heavy with determination. He approached the master bedroom and found Carolyn sitting at the vanity, absent-mindedly brushing her hair. She glanced at him in the mirror as he entered, her face unreadable. "Christopher," she said softly. Her voice was cautious. "What's going on?" He shut the door behind him, standing at the end of the bed, his fists clenched at his sides. "We need to talk." Carolyn turned around, setting her hairbrush on the nightstand. "About what?" she asked, though her voice carried a tired edge. "You know exactly what this is about." Christopher's tone was low, simmering with frustration. "Pamela." Carolyn's face lost some color, but she held her ground, looking right at him. "I told you already. I never meant for things to get this far. I thought it was what you needed. What we needed." Christopher's jaw tightened. "What we needed? You honestly believe that ripping my daughter away from me was in our best interest? For us?" Carolyn's eyes filled with tears, and she stood, slowly moving toward him. "Christopher, please. I never wanted to hurt you." "Hurt me?" Christopher's voice rose, his anger spilling out. "You tore my world apart. You took away the one person who meant everything to me. And you think saying you didn't mean to makes it all okay?" Carolyn flinched, but didn't back down. "I was desperate," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought if she was gone, we could have a fresh start. You could finally move on. We could be a real family without you constantly looking for someone who isn't here. A ghost. Is that what you think?" Christopher's voice grew icy. "She wasn't a ghost, Carolyn. She was my daughter, my flesh and blood. And you took her from me. Why? Because you were jealous?" Tears streamed down Carolyn's face as she shook her head. "I was scared," she whispered. "I was terrified that I wouldn't ever be enough for you. I saw how much you still loved Melissa, how much Pamela reminded you of her. I thought I was losing you. So I did what I thought was necessary." Christopher's chest felt tight with disbelief and fury. "You sent a child away. A child, Carolyn. Do you even understand what you've done?" "I do," she sobbed, collapsing onto the bed. "I know I destroyed everything. I know I can never fix it. But Christopher, I did it because I love you." Christopher stared at her, his heart aching with a deep, bitter sadness. "If you really loved me, you never would have taken her from me. You never would have let me live all these years thinking she was gone for good." Carolyn gazed at him, her cheeks stained with tears. "What can I do? How can I fix this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You can't," Christopher responded, his tone cold and unyielding. "It's too late." An uneasy silence settled in the room, broken only by Carolyn's sobs. Christopher stood there, unmoved. The trust he'd once given her had been shattered by her deepest betrayal, and there was no undoing it. After a moment, Christopher shifted, stepping toward the door. "I'm filing for divorce," he said flatly. "And you can bet everyone's going to know what you did." Panic spread across Carolyn's face. "No, Christopher, don't. Please," she pleaded. "It's over," he said, his voice sharp and final. "You've destroyed everything." With that, he walked out, closing the door behind him. The house felt stifling, filled with memories of all his mistakes and the betrayal that cut deepest. He needed to get out, to breathe. Christopher drove aimlessly, the city lights whizzing by as his grip tightened on the steering wheel. His mind was a mess. Everything had unraveled so fast. His marriage was in ruins. His bond with Pamela seemed broken beyond repair. But in the midst of all the chaos, there was one thing keeping him grounded: Pamela. After all this time, he'd found her. She might not remember him yet, but she was still his daughter. He wasn't going to lose her again. Pulling to the side of the road, Christopher pulled out his phone and dialed Eric's number. After a few rings, the private investigator picked up, his voice gruff. "Christopher, what's going on?" "I need your help," Christopher said, his voice steady. "There's more to this than what I know. I need to understand why Carolyn did this and who else was involved." Eric X. Arnold heavily. "You're sure you want to keep digging?" "I'm sure," Christopher confirmed. "There's something more. Carolyn didn't do this alone. I need to know everything." "All right," Eric said. "I'll see what I can uncover." Christopher hung up, sinking back into his seat, the weight of the past few days pressing down on him. He had traveled a long way, found Pamela, and uncovered Carolyn's betrayal. But too many questions still lingered, and he wasn't going to rest until he had answers to every last one. His thoughts kept returning to Pamela, his daughter, lost and now found again. He didn't know how to fix things between them, or where to even begin mending the damage that had been done. But he would. He had no choice. With a deep breath, Christopher started the car and began the drive home. There was a tough journey ahead, but this time he wasn't facing it alone. He had Pamela now, and no matter what came next, he was ready to fight for her. Christopher sat in his office, tapping his fingers restlessly on the desk, waiting for Eric's call. Each minute stretched on endlessly as the unresolved questions gnawed at him. He knew there had to be more to the story. Carolyn couldn't have pulled off something this elaborate by herself. But who else was involved? And why? He needed closure, not just for him, but for Pamela too. The phone buzzed, cutting through the silence. Christopher grabbed it quickly. "Eric, what did you find?" Eric's voice was calm on the other end. "You were right, Christopher. There's more to this than just Carolyn." Christopher's stomach tightened. He had suspected this, but hearing it aloud made the betrayal feel even worse. "Who else?" he asked. "I did some digging into Carolyn's past," Eric started. "Turns out, she wasn't working alone. There was someone else helping her, someone who had a strong reason to keep Pamela out of the picture." Christopher's heart raced as he waited for Eric to go on. "Carolyn was working with a guy named Joshua Arnold," Eric explained. "He's a lawyer, but he's also been involved in some shady stuff over the years, mostly helping people hide assets or twist inheritance laws." Christopher's mind spun. Joshua Arnold. The name rang a bell. Why would she partner with him? Eric paused briefly. Because Carolyn wanted to make sure Pamela never returned to claim what was rightfully hers. From what I've found, Arnold helped Carolyn set up the whole scheme, making sure Pamela disappeared for good and wouldn't be traced back to you. Christopher felt a wave of anger swell inside him. Carolyn didn't just take his daughter away out of envy. She did it to tighten her grip on his wealth, ensuring Pamela would never receive any inheritance. For years, she manipulated him, exploiting his grief while secretly securing her own power. "Where's Arnold now?" Christopher asked, his voice taut with tension. "That's the tricky part," Eric replied. "He's been laying low for a while, but I've got some leads. I'm closing in on him." Christopher ground his teeth. "I want to talk to him. I need answers." "You'll get them," Eric assured, "but be cautious. This guy knows how to stay hidden. He's a pro at covering his tracks." "I don't care how good he is," Christopher said, his voice firm. "I'll track him down, and I'll make sure he pays for everything he's done." After the call, Christopher sat in silence, his mind spinning. Carolyn's betrayal went deeper than he could have ever anticipated. It wasn't just jealousy driving her, it was all about power, control, and greed. She had taken Pamela to protect her own interests, all the while pretending to stand by him during his grief. But now, the truth was surfacing. And Christopher wasn't about to stop until everyone involved faced the consequences. Meanwhile, Pamela sat alone in her small apartment, still shaken from her conversation with her adoptive mother. The words kept playing over in her mind. "We didn't know who you were when we found you." She had always believed her past would remain a mystery, something she'd never uncover. But now, everything was different. The pendant around her neck felt heavier than ever, like a symbol of a life she couldn't remember. She turned it over in her hands, her eyes fixed on the tiny emerald stone she had always worn. Christopher's words echoed in her thoughts. Could she truly be Pamela Shelton? Could the man claiming to be her father really be telling the truth? Part of her wanted to believe him. The look in his eyes when he spoke, it was filled with so much emotion, so much pain. He seemed to truly believe what he was saying. But how could she trust a man she barely knew? How could she accept that everything she thought she knew about her life was a lie? Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was her adoptive mother, Rebecca. Pamela paused for a moment before answering. "Laura," Rebecca's voice trembled. "I mean, Pamela, I'm truly sorry." Pamela felt her throat tighten. "Why didn't you ever tell me the truth? Why didn't you let me know I had a family searching for me?" "I wanted to." Rebecca's voice cracked with emotion. "But we didn't know. We didn't know who you really were until that man showed up at the store. We only knew you as the little girl we found, and we loved you. We never wanted to lose you." Pamela closed her eyes, emotions swirling within her. "But you did lose me," she whispered. "You lost me the moment you didn't tell me the truth." Silence filled the other end of the line, and Pamela knew her words had landed hard. But she couldn't ignore what she felt. Her whole life, something had always felt off, and now she understood why. "I'm so sorry," Rebecca whispered once more. "I wish we had done things differently." Pamela didn't know what to say. She had loved her adoptive parents, but now everything felt tarnished. She wasn't sure who she was anymore. She wasn't Laura Woodward. She was Pamela Shelton, the daughter of a man who had been searching for her for 18 years. "I need time to figure this out," Pamela said softly. "I just need some time." "I understand," Rebecca said gently. "Take as much time as you need. We'll always be here for you." Pamela hung up, feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders. She wasn't sure where to go from here. Her life had flipped upside down, and she had no idea how to piece it all back together. Later that night, Christopher sat in the living room, staring into the fire. The house was still, but the silence was overwhelming. Carolyn was gone. Her things were packed up and moved out, leaving behind a void that echoed his own. The doorbell rang, snapping him out of his thoughts. He wasn't expecting anyone. But when he opened the door, his heart stopped. Pamela stood there, pale, her eyes filled with uncertainty. I didn't know where else to go." Her voice was soft, trembling. Christopher felt a surge of emotions rise up inside him. Relief, hope, and fear washed over him as he stepped aside, gesturing for her to come inside. "I'm glad you're here," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Pamela paused briefly before entering. She stood in the middle of the living room, her eyes scanning the space, as if trying to piece together a life she couldn't remember. "I don't know what to think anymore," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I don't know who I am." Christopher's heart ached, hearing her words. He wanted to reach out to reassure her, but he knew this was a journey she had to navigate in her own time. "You're Pamela," he said softly. "You're my daughter," he added. "And I'll be here for you, no matter what." Tears welled up in Pamela's eyes as she turned away, struggling to keep her emotions in check. "I don't remember anything," she whispered. "I don't remember you. I don't remember my past." Christopher stepped closer, his voice tender but full of feeling. "That's okay," he said. "You don't have to remember everything right now. We have time. We'll figure this out together." For a moment, Pamela stayed silent, her gaze fixed on the floor. Then slowly, she nodded. "I don't know where to begin." Christopher felt a flicker of hope. "We'll start wherever you want," he assured her. "We'll take it one step at a time." Pamela lifted her eyes to him, a mix of confusion and fear swirling within them. "What if I never remember?" Christopher swallowed, keeping his voice steady. "Then we'll make new memories." The days that followed were slow, filled with uncertainty, but also a cautious hope. Pamela had moved into a small guest room in Christopher's house. Though she kept her distance, it was clear she was trying to process everything she had learned. Her past, the lies she had been living, and the father, who now felt like a stranger. Christopher didn't push her. He gave her the space she needed, but made sure she knew he was there. Each morning, they'd sit together for breakfast, making small talk about nothing in particular. At first, it was awkward. Both of them weren't quite sure how to close the huge gap that had grown between them. But little by little, as the days passed, they started to feel a bit more at ease. Christopher did his best to remain patient. He realized that for Pamela, this wasn't just about reconnecting with him. It was about finding herself again. She was dealing with a deep sense of confusion, stuck between the life she had always known and the hidden truths she was now facing. Every time they spoke, Christopher could see the inner turmoil in her eyes, the weight of it bearing down on her. One morning, as they sat together at the kitchen table, Pamela finally broke the silence. "Do you ever think about Mom?" she asked softly, her voice uncertain, as if she wasn't sure if it was the right thing to ask. Christopher felt a familiar ache in his chest at the mention of Melissa. "Every day," he confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "She was the love of my life. Losing her was the hardest thing I've ever been through." Pamela nodded, her eyes distant. "I don't remember her. I wish I did." Christopher's heart ached for everything Pamela had lost. "She was amazing," he said gently. "Strong, too. In a lot of ways, you remind me of her." Tears welled up in Pamela's eyes as she looked away, her hands tightly clasped in her lap. "It's strange," she whispered. "I've always felt like there was this big, empty space inside me that I couldn't explain. And now I know why. But it doesn't make it any easier." Christopher reached out, resting his hand softly on hers. "I know this is tough," he said quietly. "I don't expect everything to be perfect right away, but I'm here. It's also den de center de sius sarde se bin maxis de tukshu dinnerbo. No matter what you need." Pamela looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but also a small glimmer of hope. "I want to know more," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "About you. About her. About our life. Before." Christopher's heart swelled with emotion. This was the first sign that Pamela truly wanted to reconnect, to understand the life she had been separated from. He nodded, his voice steady. "I'll tell you everything." That evening, Christopher brought out a box of old family photos, ones he hadn't looked at in years. Together, they sat on the living room floor, sorting through the memories. For Christopher, it felt like opening a time capsule, full of moments from a life that had slipped away almost 2 decades ago. "This was our home," Christopher said, holding up a picture of a beautiful colonial house surrounded by tall trees. "We lived there before everything changed." Pamela stared at the photo, her brow furrowing as she tried to recall memories that felt just out of reach. "It looks kind of familiar," she murmured, though there was doubt in her voice. Christopher gave her a soft smile. He used to love playing in that backyard. There was this huge oak tree, and you'd spend hours climbing it, even though Mom was always worried you'd fall. Pamela's lips curled into a small smile. "That definitely sounds like me." Christopher chuckled quietly, a warmth filling his chest. It was the first time in a long while they had shared something like this, a memory, even if it wasn't one Pamela could fully remember. As they flipped through more photos, Christopher began telling her stories about her childhood. Little things, like her favorite toys, the songs she used to sing, and how she'd follow him around the house, bombarding him with questions about how everything worked. "Mum sounds incredible," Pamela said softly, her eyes lingering on a photo of Melissa holding her as a baby. "I wish I had more time with her." Christopher swallowed, his throat tight with emotion. "She would have been so proud of you, Pamela," he said quietly. "She loved you more than anything." Pamela glanced up at him, her eyes welling with tears. "I want to remember her," she whispered. "I want to remember our life. But I don't know how." Christopher reached over and gently wiped a tear from her cheek. "It's okay," he said. "You don't have to remember everything right now. What matters is that we're here, together. We can create new memories." Pamela gave a slight nod, though her expression still showed hesitation. "I'm trying," she said quietly, "but it's hard. I don't know how to be Pamela again." "You don't have to be the same person," Christopher said gently. "You're not just that little girl anymore. You've grown, you've lived your own life, and no one's asking you to forget that. You're still Laura, but you're also Pamela now. And whatever that means, we'll figure it out together." Pamela looked at him, her expression softening as she took in his words. For the first time since they had reunited, she seemed to relax a bit, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft yet full of emotion, "for not giving up on me." Christopher felt a swell of emotion tighten in his chest as he gently reached out and held her hand. "I never will," he assured her. "I spent 18 years looking for you, and now that I've found you, I'm not letting go." For the rest of the evening, they sat together, flipping through old photographs, sharing stories, and slowly rebuilding the bond that had been broken for so long. It was fragile, uncertain, but it was there. For the first time in what felt like forever, Christopher allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. In the following weeks, Christopher and Pamela settled into a new routine. It wasn't always easy. There were awkward moments, and the weight of everything that had happened still loomed between them. But there were also moments of connection, shared smiles, quiet understanding, and even laughter. Christopher made it a point to take Pamela to places that used to be significant to their family: her old childhood home, the park where they had played, and other familiar spots from the past. Each visit brought a new layer to their relationship, slowly helping them reconnect. One afternoon they went to the small cemetery where Melissa was buried. The space was peaceful, with tall trees casting shade over the headstones. Christopher knelt down beside the grave, tracing his fingers over her name, engraved in the stone. "She would have loved to see you again," he said softly. Pamela stood beside him, her eyes clouded with sadness as she gazed at the grave. "I wish I could remember her," she whispered. "You don't have to remember everything to know she loved you," Christopher said gently. "Her love was always there, and it still is." Pamela nodded, and for a while, they stood together in silence, the weight of both past and present hanging in the air. In the weeks after their visit to the cemetery, Christopher and Pamela continued to rebuild their relationship, slowly, piece by piece. There were still moments of tension when Pamela's confusion about her past overwhelmed her. But she was trying, genuinely trying, to accept this new reality, that Christopher was truly her father, and that her previous life wasn't the whole picture of who she was. Christopher, on his side, felt a mix of relief and guilt. He had finally found his daughter after years of searching, but the loss of time and what could have been still haunted him. Years had passed, and with them, countless memories lost to time that he could never reclaim. The weight of those lost years haunted him. He had to constantly remind himself to be patient, to give Pamela the time and space she needed to process everything. But it was far from easy. Every time he looked at her, the grief over the time they had missed together hit him hard. One evening, they found themselves sitting in the living room, the soft glow from the fireplace casting long shadows around them. Pamela sat quietly, absent-mindedly twirling the pendant in her fingers, something she always did when lost in thought. "I've been thinking about Mom a lot lately," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Christopher looked up, his chest heavy with emotion. "That's normal," he responded gently. "She's a part of you, even if the memories are fuzzy." Pamela nodded slowly. "I just wish I had more memories of her. I want to remember her voice, her laugh. Anything." Christopher leaned back in his chair, staring into the flickering flames. "You were really young when she passed. Nobody expects you to remember it all, but I can tell you more about her, if you'd like." Pamela hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I'd like that." Christopher drew in a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "Your mom, Melissa, she was incredible. Strong, kind, patient. She loved you more than anything. Finding out she was pregnant with you was the best day of our lives. We had tried for so long. You were our miracle." Pamela smiled faintly, her eyes softening. "She sounds wonderful." "She was," Christopher said, his voice thick with emotion. "She'd be so proud of you, of the woman you've grown into." They sat in a comfortable silence for a while, the weight of Christopher's words hanging in the air. After a few moments, Pamela glanced at him, her brow furrowed. "What was it like after she died?" she asked. Christopher swallowed hard, the familiar ache of loss settling deep in his chest. "It was devastating. It felt like my whole world crumbled. I didn't know how to move forward, but then I had you. You gave me a reason to keep going." Tears welled up in Pamela's eyes as she listened. "And then I left." Christopher's heart ached, hearing the sadness in her voice. "Yes, when you were gone, it was like losing everything all over again. I spent years searching for you, hoping, praying that I'd find you." Pamela wiped her eyes, her voice shaky. "I'm so sorry." Christopher's frown deepened, his heart breaking for her. "You have nothing to apologize for, Pamela. None of this is because of you." "I know," she whispered softly, "but I can't help feeling like I've missed so much. I've missed you. I've missed Mom. I've missed my whole life." Christopher gently took her hand, his touch reassuring. "We can't change what's already happened, but we have the future ahead of us. We can create new memories together." Pamela's eyes met his, filled with doubt. "But what if I can never fully remember who I used to be?" Christopher gave her hand a comforting squeeze. "Then we'll focus on who you are right now. You don't need to be the same person you were. You're Pamela, and you're also Laura. And that's just fine." Pamela nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I just wish I knew how to move forward, how to be both of them." Christopher felt his heart ache. He wished he could take away her pain, make everything right again, but he knew this was something she had to figure out for herself. "It'll take time," he said gently, "but you'll get there. and I'll be with you every step of the way." The next day, Christopher got a call from Eric. His voice cut through the quiet of Christopher's office like a blade. "Christopher, we've got him." Christopher's heart raced. "Arnold?" "Yeah," Eric confirmed. "He's been hiding out in Seattle under a fake name, but we have enough to bring him in." Anger bubbled up inside Christopher. Joshua Arnold, the man who helped Carolyn make his daughter disappear, the man who tore his family apart, was finally within reach. "What's the next move?" Christopher asked, his voice tense. "I've already contacted the authorities," Eric replied. "They're moving in to arrest him. After that, we'll get a chance to talk to him, get the whole story." Christopher's grip tightened on the phone. "I want to be there." "You will be," Eric reassured him. "This is your chance to get closure, Christopher. We're so close." After the call ended, Christopher leaned back in his chair, his thoughts racing. He'd been searching for answers for so long, and now they were almost in his grasp. But as the reality settled in, a sense of dread crept over him. What would Arnold reveal? What other secrets could come out about the conspiracy that shattered his family? And what would these new revelations mean for Pamela? A few days later, Christopher and Eric met with the authorities in Seattle. The air was thick with tension as they awaited the arrest. Christopher's heart raced as he stood outside the shabby, worn-down motel where Arnold had been hiding out. This was the moment he had been anticipating for so long. Just a few minutes passed before they spotted movement. The officers swooped in, and in no time, Joshua Arnold was in handcuffs. Christopher's gaze locked onto the man who had been a part of wrecking his life alongside Carolyn. Arnold appeared older, more ragged than Christopher remembered, but there was still something sharp and calculated in his expression. As they walked Arnold toward the police car, his eyes met Christopher's. There was a flicker of recognition, but no sign of regret. Christopher felt a knot in his stomach, realizing that this man never cared about the destruction he caused. It had always been about greed, power, and control. Eric came over to Christopher, resting a hand on his shoulder. "We'll get our chance to talk to him," Eric said. "We'll get the answers we need." Christopher nodded, though the weight in his chest remained. He wasn't sure what he would say when they finally confronted Arnold. But one thing was certain. He needed the truth, and he wouldn't stop until he had it. Later that evening, back at the house, Christopher found Pamela sitting quietly on the porch, watching the last light of the day fade away. She seemed so small and vulnerable in that moment, and a wave of protectiveness washed over him. He sat beside her, the cool evening breeze lifting his hair. "I have news," he said softly. Pamela turned toward him, her forehead creased in concern. "What is it?" "They found Joshua Arnold, the man who helped Carolyn. He's been arrested." Pamela's face went pale, and she turned away, nervously twisting her hands together. "What happens next?" she asked. "We'll get to talk to him," Christopher answered gently. "We'll finally get the full story." Pamela didn't respond for a while. Her eyes were still focused on the distant horizon. "Do you think knowing everything will actually help?" Christopher sighed, not sure how to respond. "I don't know, but we need to know," he said. Pamela nodded slightly, though doubt lingered on her face. "I'm scared of what else we might discover," she whispered. Christopher placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "No matter what comes, we'll face it together." Pamela gave a slight nod, uncertainty clouding her eyes. "I just hope it's all over," she whispered. Christopher sat in the dim, shadowy interrogation room, his heart racing as he waited for Joshua Arnold to be brought in. This was the moment he had longed for, the moment where the truth would finally come out. Across from him, sat Eric, the key figure in tracking Arnold down. Christopher shot him a glance of appreciation for his steadfast support, though his mind was elsewhere. The door creaked open, and 2 officers led Arnold into the room. He appeared smaller than Christopher had pictured, disheveled and weary. Yet there was still an air of arrogance about him, as if he believed he could talk his way out of whatever mess he was in. Arnold took a seat across from Christopher, and the tension grew thicker. Christopher leaned in, his eyes never leaving Arnold's. "You know why I'm here?" Arnold raised an eyebrow, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I'm guessing it's about your daughter. But let's be clear. I was just a middleman. The real mastermind was your wife." Christopher's voice was calm, but underneath it was a barely contained fury. "Carolyn might have started this," he said, his tone steady. "But you were her partner. In crime. You're just as guilty for what happened to Pamela. I want the truth. How you did it. Why you kept it hidden for so long." Arnold leaned back, crossing his arms. "It was business at Shelton. Carolyn saw your daughter as a threat, not just to her influence over you, but more importantly, to the inheritance." Christopher's jaw clenched, fists tightening beneath the table. "So you helped her make my daughter disappear, my 7-year-old daughter, so Carolyn could control me and my money?" Arnold shrugged, as if it was the most straightforward explanation. "It wasn't just about money," he said coolly. "It was about power. Carolyn knew you'd never fully let go of Pamela or Melissa's memory. She couldn't stand that. So, she came to me. I had the connections to make sure Pamela vanished without a trace." Christopher's heart pounded, fury boiling just under the surface. He had suspected most of this, but hearing it so callously spelled out, the way his daughter had been used as a pawn in Carolyn's twisted game, made it even more unbearable. "And you never once thought about what that would do to her, or to me?" Christopher's voice trembled with fury. "The destruction you left behind." Arnold met his gaze with a cold, detached expression. "I was hired to do a job. I did it. What happened afterward wasn't my responsibility." Christopher slammed his fist down on the table, making Arnold jump slightly. "She's my daughter," he bellowed. "You stole her life, her memories, her identity. You ripped everything away from her and from me. You tore my family apart." Arnold remained composed, though a flicker of unease crossed his eyes. "I won't deny it," he said. "But you've got her back now, don't you? You found her." Christopher glared at him, his breath ragged with anger. 18 years, he growled through clenched teeth. 18 years without knowing where she was. 18 years of agony, missing out on her entire childhood. You can't undo that. Nothing can. Arnold's smirk faded, his gaze shifting as the weight of his actions settled in. But Christopher wasn't done. "You're going to prison," Christopher said coldly. "For a long time. And I'll make sure you pay for every second of the years I spent looking for my daughter." Arnold didn't answer, staring at the table, his confidence crumbling as reality caught up with him. Eric rested a hand on Christopher's shoulder. "That's enough," he said quietly. "We've got what we came for." Christopher rose, his eyes never leaving Arnold. "You wrecked my life," he said softly, "but I'll make sure you never do this to anyone else again." With that, Christopher turned and walked out, adrenaline and anger still coursing through him. He had finally gotten the answers he sought, but they offered no solace. Instead, they only magnified the pain, the understanding that no matter what, those lost years with Pamela were gone forever. Back home, Christopher found Pamela sitting in the garden, the fading sunlight casting a soft glow across her face. She looked serene, but her expression carried the same weight he felt. He sat beside her, the silence between them heavy but comfortable, filled with things unsaid. "I heard you went to see him," Pamela whispered, her fingers lightly brushing the pendant she wore. Christopher nodded, his voice low. "I had to hear it from him. I needed to know why." Pamela remained quiet for a while, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. Did knowing the whole truth make a difference? Christopher leaned back on the bench, letting out a long sigh. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "In some ways it helps, but it doesn't make anything easier. It doesn't change the past." Pamela gave a slow nod, her gaze distant. "I thought learning the truth would bring me peace. But now, I just feel hollow, like there's nothing left to grasp onto." Christopher's chest ached at the sadness in her voice. "You've still got me," he said gently, "and I've got you. We've lost a lot, but we haven't lost each other." Pamela turned toward him, her eyes filled with a quiet, deep sadness. "I want to move forward, Dad," she whispered, calling him Dad for the first time since they'd been reunited. The word filled Christopher with a mix of happiness and heartache. He reached over, taking her hand softly. "We'll figure it out together," he assured her. "We've got time. No need to rush." Pamela gave a small nod, though her face still showed traces of doubt. "I just want to feel normal again," she admitted quietly. "But I'm not sure what normal even is anymore." Christopher gently squeezed her hand. "Normal doesn't mean going back to how things were. It's about finding a new path forward, and we'll get there together." They sat in silence, the sun setting slowly, casting a warm glow across the garden. It wasn't the picture-perfect ending Christopher had once hoped for. There were still wounds and scars that would take time to heal. But sitting there with his daughter, hand in hand, he realized this was enough. After all these years, having each other was more than he had ever thought possible. After a long pause, Pamela spoke again, her voice soft but determined. "I want to keep trying. I want to make new memories with you." Christopher smiled, his heart swelling with hope. "We will. We'll start making new memories, starting today." Pamela looked at him, the faintest smile pulling at the corners of her lips. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. For the first time in years, Christopher felt a deep sense of peace. The journey ahead would be hard, but they would walk it together, ready for whatever came their way. As the sun dipped below the horizon, father and daughter sat side by side. The future lay ahead, full of the promise of new beginnings.